Morning, everyone. We'll just give it a few moments just whilst people can join us. So we'll just wait a few moments before starting. I can see that most people have joined on now, so we will make a start. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our June webinar. We're going slightly back to basics today from some of the topics that we've been discussing recently, and we're going to consider the legal topic of collective consultation. Now, collective consultation is one of those areas, one of those phrases that lawyers like to talk about, but often we don't really discuss it in much detail about what it actually means in practice. And we thought it would be a really good timely reminder because, as we know, many businesses are going to start looking at their workforces. We know that employers are looking at their terms and conditions of employment and considering whether they need to make any changes to those. So it's a really important time to go back and revisit and refocus on collective consultation, and for us to be able to share with you some of those tips and techniques that we have to make the process work effectively. As ever, I am joined by one of my colleagues, and today I'm really pleased that Andrew Whiteaker can join me. Andy is a partner in the employment team. So morning, Andy.
Hi, Emma. Morning, everyone.
And I'm really pleased that Andy can join me today because Andy works a lot with our clients in helping them with not only collective redundancy consultation exercises, but also assisting clients with staff representative training and working with clients who do have trade union representation. So really pleased that Andy can join me today. For those who don't know me, I'm Emma O'Connor. I'm a director and head of our HR training academy here in the employment team. And if you don't know Boyes Turner, we are a commercial law firm based in the Thames Valley, looking after clients again in the Thames Valley, but also across the UK and also globally. We help with HR advice, coaching, mediation. We also help with litigation, business immigration, as well as training. So please do get in touch with us if we can help following this webinar if you have any questions. So let's make a start then, Andy. And what we thought we would do is, as I said, go back to basics, give employers and managers a really good reminder about what collective consultation is. Before I start, I should just say that although we will be talking about redundancies, we will be talking about changing terms and conditions of employment, this isn't a webinar talking specifically about those issues, but we're going to be talking about them in the round when we focus on collective consultation. So Andy, when we talk about collective consultation, what do we mean and what are some of the obligations?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. So as you said in your introduction, this is a term that we lawyers use quite a lot and talk about the idea of collective consultation as if everyone knows exactly what that means and understands the detail of it, but that's not always the case. Very broadly, when we're talking about collective consultation, what we mean is it's where there is a legal obligation that obliges employers to provide certain information to and then discuss with employee representatives or trade union reps issues around, more often than not, it's regarding proposed dismissals by reason of redundancies, which is why it's something that does arise a lot when we're talking about large-scale redundancy exercises. In particular, as far as the consultation is concerned, there's an expectation that you will have an open and honest conversation with the representatives about what is being proposed. And the consultation needs to cover, very broadly again, ways in which the dismissals could potentially be avoided, ways in which you could potentially reduce the number of employees that are being affected by the redundancy exercise, mitigating the consequences of any of the dismissals that may be necessary, and also how the business can plan for the future. So there's a fair amount to discuss with reps as and when the obligation arises.
Absolutely. And although, as I've said, it's not a webinar where we'll be talking about, redundancy and collective redundancy in that sort of procedural detail, I think it's important when we talk about collective consultation to understand it within the context of some of the processes and procedures that maybe, our audience is aware of. So when we think about that duty to inform and consult, we're talking about those representatives, those appropriate representatives of affected employees. So those employees who are affected by the decision or the process. But again, that statutory obligation to collectively consult does kick in when we think about that collective redundancy process, where we have those numbers. So we are playing that sort of numbers game. So where you are proposing to dismiss as redundant 20 or more employees, then we have these minimum consultation obligations that we need to follow, and they're set out in statute. So it's 20 or more at one establishment, and again within that period of 90 days. It's not just those collective consultation obligations that we need to be aware of, but we also need to think about those individual consultation obligations as well, because not only can an employer fall foul of those statutory obligations, those statutory rules around collective consultation, we've also got to think about unfair dismissal rules that individuals can bring as well if they meet that qualifying level of service. I've also popped up on the slide there that requirement to file form HR1, really important there that you complete that form, and actually that does form part of the information that's actually given to the consultative body. So really important there, and some serious consequences for employers if that is not followed. If you've got any questions about redundancy, then give us a shout after the webinar. Really happy to talk about it. But again, just remember we've got those collective obligations, but also those individual obligations as well.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, that simply because you tick the box as far as consulting on a collective level, that doesn't necessarily mean that any dismissal that arises as a result of that will be fair and it will be deemed to have properly consulted with the affected individual. So there may well be obligations to speak to individuals separately, as well as going through the collective exercise too. But as far as collective consultation is concerned, there are also implications as a result of a failure to follow the collective consultation requirements as and when it is triggered. And in particular, if you don't follow the rules, then a protective award may be made, and it can be paid to all of the affected employees. So everyone who's been affected by the process and where there was an obligation to consult with representatives on their behalf. And the award is calculated to be a punishment upon the employer for failing to carry out the consultation exercise. This isn't something that's calculated on the basis of what someone might have lost. Instead, this is, well, actually, you have failed to do this and we're going to penalise you for having done that. So it's important to make sure that you do undertake this process to avoid those potential claims being pursued and you having to make a compensation payment to the affected employees.
Now we say, and we've added to the slide there, that when we talk about the consultation period, that time, be it 30 days or 45 days, we say that they are minimum consultation periods. What do we mean by that, and what are the implications there for employers potentially? Yeah,
so we do talk about these 30 or 45 day consultation periods, and sometimes there's a slight misapprehension that that's it. You ensure that the consultation covers that period and therefore you've done all that you need to do, but it is really just a minimum period. It's set out in legislation, the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act from back in 1992. But as well as it's specifying these particular periods, there's also a requirement for employers to commence consultation with employees in good time. So what that means, and has been held to mean in the past, is that if decisions are already made, and this is essentially just a fait accompli, then potentially there can be arguments run by the individuals or their representatives that the consultation has not begun in good time, because actually all decisions have been made in advance, and it's merely a fait accompli and just a box ticking exercise to pause for a 30 or 45-day period before any redundancies take effect. Yeah, that can be and has been claims that have been pursued successfully in the past against employers. So you do need to start that consultation exercise in good time prior to any redundancies taking place. And I keep saying when redundancies take place. What that means is that, in theory at least, let's say you're making or proposing to make 25 redundancies and you're consulting with the representatives about that. You could, in theory, give notice to the affected employees during that 30-day period. So you could conclude that we've run out of things to talk about during that 30-day period and give notice to one or more of the employees who might be made redundant, provided that notice period does not expire before the 30-day period. Okay, so that's what we mean being effective. So you can potentially give notice, but as long as that notice doesn't take effect, as long as the dismissal doesn't take place within the minimum 30 or 45-day period, then you can say, well, we have technically met our obligations of not dismissing within the protected period. The difficulty with that, as I'm sure you can appreciate, is whether or not you've properly and effectively consulted with the employees, because as we've said already, this isn't just a box ticking exercise. There is an obligation to consult properly. And if therefore you are giving notice within that 30 or 45-day period, then that does leave you open for someone to say, well, this hasn't been a sufficient or meaningful exercise. Even if the dismissal doesn't take effect within that period, you haven't consulted with me properly. So it's quite a brave employer that takes the view that during that period they've said all that needs to be said, and they issue notice within that period.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Andy. Thank you for that. And like all great things, it's not the whole story, is it, Andy? When we talk about collective consultation obligations, and obviously we've mentioned it in terms of collective redundancies, but it's not the whole story, is it?
No, that's right. So collective consultation arises when we are looking at those sort of classic redundancy exercises where we're closing a department or a particular location, something like that. But it can also arise when we're looking at potential firing and rehiring exercises, which is something that's been in the news in the last week or so, with various proposals as to whether or not it should be outlawed.
No, absolutely, and I think that sort of fire and rehire, that phrase that, as you said, we've heard a lot about, particularly with consultation. It was raised in Parliament as well. So I think it's one to really watch this space on. But what other areas, Andy, might employers find that they need to go back to and collectively consult?
Well, it can arise when there are 2P exercises. Obviously, that's slightly outside of the scope of what we're talking about today to go into the exciting detail of 2P, but there can also be collective consultation obligations similarly in respect of pension scheme amendments and some health and safety situations too. But for the purposes of what we're talking about today, it's probably going to be those large-scale redundancy exercises and these firing and rehiring exercises. And the reason for that is the definition of redundancy under the Trade Union Labour Relations Act, which has been held to be wide enough to include a situation where 20 people or 20 or more people are having their contracts terminated, even if you're then offering them re-employment at the conclusion of their notice period. And that's typically what a hire and refire exercise would look like. You're seeking to agree the variation to particular contractual terms with your workforce, whether it be around working time or place of work or some benefits that you can no longer afford, whatever that might be. You seek to try and reach agreement with them. But if that agreement is not forthcoming, then an option to the employer is to give notice to terminate the individual's employment with an offer of re-employment the following day or the day after the notice expires on the new terms and conditions of employment. And so that would, under the wording of the Trade Union Labour Relations Act, that would represent a redundancy for the purposes of these collective consultation obligations. So that that's sometimes something that employers miss and don't appreciate, that could trigger it. So if there is a hire and rehire exercise that could happen because of contractual intention to amend contractual terms, then that really does need to be factored into any decision making and any timelines you're looking to put together about how quickly you might be able to impose those contractual variations.
Absolutely, and how complicated the process could become. Absolutely. And we've talked about when should we start consultation. Obviously we've talked about it should begin in good time, but how does the sort of the 30-day and the 45-day period, how does that fit in with the sort of the planning and the timetabling, Andy?
Yeah, and that is a really important point, because it's an area where you can sometimes get in a muddle about, because the clock starts ticking, if you like, once you have provided the representatives with the statutory information that you're required to give to them. And as Emma has already mentioned earlier on, part of that statutory information you're supposed to give to the representatives is the HR1. So therefore, it stands to reason that the clock can't start ticking until you have completed and filed your HR1 with the Secretary of State, the form saying this is what our proposals are, this is what it might look like, these are the people that, or the groups of people that might be affected. But also, hang on a second, we have to give that form to the affected to the representatives of the affected employees. So that means that those representatives need to be in place before the consultation process starts. So we're talking a little bit about how you might end up with those representatives, but the key thing is that clock does not start ticking until the reps have been identified, the HR1 has been filed, and then you provide that HR1 with the additional information to those reps. That's when the clock starts ticking. And if you perceive it might be just when we've announced to the employees that there might be redundancies, then you can find yourself ending up in a sticky situation where you haven't waited the requisite minimum period before making or affecting any decisions.
Absolutely. It's really important to know at what stage things are going to happen and when those timings and when that clock starts. Really important there to make sure that we are compliant, and also we've got that sufficient and meaningful consultation. So staff reps, let's move on to talk about staff reps and who might those staff reps be. And I suppose the first question is about what if the employer already recognises a trade union and has trade union reps in place. Is that the same thing?
Well, probably, because if you do have a recognition agreement in place with a trade union, the likelihood is that recognition agreement will empower or mandate that the the trade union representatives, are authorised to take part in employee consultation of this nature. So the likelihood is, if you do have a recognition agreement in place covering the affected group of individuals, which recognises the union's right to be the appropriate representatives in such circumstances, then you're already covered, and it's unlikely that you would need to get any other reps involved. If the representatives only represent, or the trade union only represents some of the individuals, so there is a wider group of individuals who are affected by it, not just those where there is a recognition agreement in place, you may still need to look to get some other reps involved so that they can properly represent that other group that don't have the trade union representation.
Okay, so trade union, okay. What about those employers that have perhaps an employee forum or a works council? What's the position there?
Well, it rather depends, to be honest with you, because it will depend upon what the works council or the employee forum is empowered to do. You will ordinarily have, or you would usually have, some sort of document in place that says this is what the Works Council is, this is what they represent the workforce about. And one of those things might be collective consultation. And if that is the case, then there you go. You've got your ready-made group of individuals with whom you can consult about the proposals. But that's not always going to be the case. And it might not be that whichever forum you have in place, there is already an expectation, or there's already some sort of documentation that identifies them as having the mandates to carry out that sort of collective consultation. And if you were to simply say, well, we've got reps in place, strictly speaking, they don't have the right to represent in respect of collective consultation, but we don't think anyone's really going to mind about it, and these guys are quite happy to do it anyway, then you run the risk of arguments that, again, you fail to inform and consult properly because employees feel they have been disenfranchised. They might want to have been reps. There are no properly appointed reps in place, and therefore, by not allowing some sort of election or volunteer exercise for people to stick their hands up, you have failed to comply with your proper obligations. So works councils and employee forums might help you, but you do need to understand what in their constitution they are mandated to do. Of course. So, sorry, yeah. Emma, go on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, so if we do find ourselves, or we don't have any sort of, mandated or standing body, what happens then? What are the options?
So if we don't have someone in place already, what we need to do instead is look to carry out some sort of election for the employees. So here, what would normally take place is you would be looking at some sort of town hall meeting or announcements to the workforce, followed up in writing, of course, advising that there is an intention to go through a process that requires the election of representatives, and therefore asking individuals whether or not they wish to volunteer to put their name forward to be a rep. And if you might identify that you need 5 representatives or a representative to cover different constituencies of affected employees, and you might find that you end up with just the perfect number of volunteers, and therefore that's nice and self-selecting.
Is there a ratio? Sorry to put you on the spot. Is there a ratio, or is it more sort of, if it's workable, 1 person to 30 or?
Yeah, there's nothing in the statute about it. It is rather a rule of thumb. If you ask 1 person to be the rep for 100 employees, for example, that seems quite an onerous job, bearing in mind they're supposed to take the feedback and listen to the concerns of their constituency. If that is the case, then that's pretty difficult for them to effectively do that. So you might feel that's too onerous a job. But if you've got 10 affected employees, for example, do you need 5 representatives? Well, I'd say you probably don't need that many. I'm always slightly loath to refuse to allow people to act as reps if they really want to do it. But I think it's about taking a sensible approach to, well, what does my constituency look like? Are the reps that we're looking for, are they going to understand the needs, desires, wants, concerns of the different groups of people that they're supposed to represent? If you can understand, right, well, we've got a sales team here, they might want to have a rep. We've got a marketing team, they might want someone who's representing them. We've got someone in technical support, we might want someone representing them. You can normally have a fairly good review as to what your constituencies look like, the size of them, and therefore how many reps you might need to properly represent them.
And we talk about this group of affected employees, and it's slightly wider, isn't it, than just the group that perhaps may be identified as at risk. Is that right, Andy?
Yeah, that's right. So it can be that your job may not be at risk as a result of the restructure or the reorganization or whatever it might be, but it might be that as a result of the proposals, you might see additional duties passed to you, or you might have a change in reporting line or something like that. So you can be affected in other ways rather than just having being placed at risk of redundancy. And therefore, as you say, Emma, there is an obligation to inform and consult with representatives of the affected employees, and that could be wider than just those who might be at risk of dismissal.
And I know we've touched upon it a little bit, but I sort of sense from clients when you sort of mention, we're going to have to collectively consult, the sort of the doom starts to set in. And I wonder whether you've got any sort of practical help or some tips around how employers can run this sort of, effective election process.
Well, like I said, it's quite a common sense process, I would say. I understand the concern about having to run the process, especially if it's something that businesses have not done before, and it can seem quite challenging. And in the current environment as well, where people aren't face to face and things have to be done remotely, then that can seem more daunting too. But more often than not, I've seen these exercises run relatively smoothly, because you don't necessarily get an avalanche of people that want to be involved. You get a few people that are keen to do it. And normally that then enables you to put together some sort of sensible body that you can then consult with. The devil is always in the detail with these things, and it is a question of planning, really. It's about working out from the outset, well, who are my affected group of employees? So who is affected by this? If I can understand that, I can then understand what those constituencies look like, and what voices we might need to hear from. I can also understand the numbers of those individuals, so therefore how many reps I might need to cover each constituency. I need to think about those employees that are absent as well. That is something that I've seen on, unfortunately, on a few occasions, where people who are absent from work, and not just physically absent in the way that a lot of us are physically absent at the moment, working remotely, but those who are maybe on long-term ill health, or potentially on maternity leave, or have taken some other form of leave of absence. It's easy to forget them. Well, I'm not sure it is necessarily easy, but they can be forgotten from time to time.
Yes, absolutely.
And then again, you have the issue of disenfranchising people and not giving the opportunity for people to have their say in the process. So do make sure you have a good, long, hard think about ensuring that everyone is involved in the process in some way, shape, or form. And clearly, someone who's been off sick for 6 months or 9 months and who's unwell, it's perhaps unlikely they might want to be a rep, but you still need to give them the opportunity. And then if they are not wanting to be a rep, but they still want to hear their voice heard, you need to think about how you can facilitate that and enable them to have proper contact with whoever their representative is. But yeah, it's really about this planning exercise. And then once you've worked out who's being, who's affected, what your constituencies look like, how many reps you think you might need, then you need to think about how you're going to carry out the voting exercise. Again, it might not be necessary because you might get the right number of volunteers for the people that you're looking for. But if you do, this is supposed to be carried out fairly and secretly, and the votes counted accurately, for obvious reasons. Depending upon your particular circumstances, you can work out what methods are available to you, whether you just use Outlook and ask people to vote on the voting buttons on an email, or whether you have something slightly more sophisticated that you use.
Or whether you have to use the postal, you have to use postal ballots as well, because, not everyone, could have access, to email or internet. So, brilliant using Outlook, as you say. Some employers use SurveyMonkey, but you might have to involve, the post, and then obviously thinking about how that's going to work logistically, and also how we're going to fit that into our timetable as well. So lots of opportunities here for employers sort of think creatively about how we can include employees within this process. So yeah, some really good tips there. And I suppose this does sort of lead to the question as well, what happens if nobody comes forward? What happens then?
Well, in those circumstances, I suppose you can ask again. Ask pretty please, would someone please do it? But if you and if you're talking about a group of, let's say, 100 plus employees, it's most likely someone's going to put their hand up. You normally find someone who's willing to do it. Where you don't get people volunteering, that's normally because it's quite a small group of individuals who are affected. So it might just be, just over the 20, so just over the threshold of requiring you to undertake this process. Or it could be, we've talked about the 20 people in the 3-month period. This can arise because you've made redundancies, and then you've got to make some more redundancies. And in that 3-month period, it all adds up to 20. So you could find that with the last tranche that you're doing, there's only maybe 4 or 5 of them, but then you're still stuck with the obligation to collectively consult because you have made more than 20 in that 3-month period. So it could be a very small number of people. The bottom line is that if you do not consult with appropriate representatives, then you are in technical breach of the legislation. Having said that, it is highly unlikely that anyone would pursue a claim alleging a failure to inform and consult because you haven't spoken to appropriate representatives when no one has put their hand up and no one is willing to volunteer to take on that mantle. If you're only talking about a very small number of people, then it's not uncommon for you to end up having to consult with people individually. But if you're talking about 100 plus, then the whole purpose of collective consultation, although it might seem like an obligation and a pain sometimes for employers, the idea is to make the process easier so that you don't have to speak to everyone. You don't have to speak to 100 people about the same things. So it's to be avoided. You really do want to get someone in place if you can.
Just following up on that point about making the process easier, I think we're asking HR managers and our staff reps to do things and be involved in a process that maybe they haven't been involved in before. And I know, Andy, that you've been involved in training specifically for managers and businesses, but also for staff reps and representative bodies as well. And I just wonder if you could just share some of the value that the audience gets out of that and why it's important to think about training at this point.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Emma. I've done some face-to-face training in the past. I've done some online interactive training with staff reps. I've done some pre-recorded training sessions as well for reps to watch at their leisure. And it is important because as much as collective consultation can seem slightly daunting for an HR professional who hasn't dealt with it that many times, if you're a layperson, if you like, with no HR experience or training whatsoever and no detailed knowledge of the law, being asked to undertake this legal task, it can be even more daunting. So there is definitely a benefit in having a conversation or providing some sort of training for the reps who have been identified so that they can understand what it is they're being asked to do and where their obligations are. We want to make sure that everyone has their opportunity to say and share their views on the proposals that are being put forward, but that requires the sort of trickle down of information from the employer to the reps down to the employees, and then for information to be shared back up again. So you do need to reps to be on the ball and to understand what it is that they're being asked to do, and also what it is they're not being asked to do as well, and what the limits of their obligations are.
I think that's a really crucial point. Yes, these are the expectations, but this is not what collective consultation is. And I think that leads really nicely into the next topic that I wanted to explore with you about, what actually is collective consultation. And I think, consultation is not negotiation. And I think that, we've got our staff reps. We've given them some training. We've also thought about how we're going to make the process work. Using technology, using the post, how are we going to do that, and how are we going to ensure that the staff reps, meet with management, and then they can cascade that information down to their affected employees, to the group that they're looking after, but also how they can feed that information back up the chain as well. And I think it's that's going to be difficult. Perhaps, how are we going to make that work? We're not having, meetings, how are we going to make that work over the technology? But, as we've said, it's about trying to reach that agreement, isn't it, with the staff reps? And it's often, employees and often staff reps can come up with some good ideas and some suggestions. And has, do you agree that that's something that, employers should sort of go into this process thinking about?
Well, I think yes, for two reasons, because first of all, you're right that reps do often come up with good ideas and alternative ways of looking at things. Whether or not it might save redundancies, who knows? But it's always useful to speak and to talk and to take other people's opinions. But also, if you do go in with an entirely closed mind, then you do run the risk of allegations about a failure to properly consult with the employees on the basis that everything was just a fait accompli and you weren't prepared to listen and there was nothing that could be said. It's nonetheless true that, as you said, this is a consultation exercise. It's not a negotiation. So it might be the case that lots of ideas are raised or suggestions are raised by the representatives, but ultimately they can't be agreed upon. The business has the right to make decisions and to decide upon its future and the course of actions it wishes to take. You would hope that you're able to explain to the representatives what you're doing and seek agreement with them. But it might also be the case that you simply can't do that, and it's not possible for agreement to be reached. But that doesn't stop you from initiating your proposal simply because agreement wasn't reached.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as well as this, this idea about consultation, obviously we've got this duty to inform as well. And there is specific information that you mentioned, Andy, that employers have to provide to the staff representatives. And we've put some of that information up on the slide there. So, what's proposed, potential numbers, description of the employees. I think that's important as well. How we're going to select. So what's the selection criteria? So again, it's all about that planning, that working all of this out, because you've got to be ready to come to the meeting with this information. So, what it's all about, that, that planning, that preparation, getting that information and then being able to provide it. How we're going to, obviously the method of selection, that the method of how we're going to do this, what's the consultation process going to look like with that collective consultation process, but also where necessary that individual consultation process sort of running in parallel there, and then to sort of provide information about, if it's a redundancy situation, how the business is going to calculate redundancy pay. So is that simply going to be statutory redundancy monies, or is there another way that monies are going to be paid? Is there going to be some sort of enhanced payment that might be offered? So I think that's sort of some of the information there. And as well, Andy, we've mentioned that Form HR1 needs to be filed as well. So it's about providing that information, getting that information out to the parties, but also having that opportunity for the information to be brought back up to management as well. Now we've talked about obviously this idea of reaching an agreement, and obviously that would be the preferred route. But obviously we live in the real world, where sometimes employers and the staff reps and the employees can't reach agreements on what is being proposed. And I wonder what happens in that situation on a practical basis, where the parties simply can't sort of reach agreement as to what's proposed.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you can reach agreement on a number of factors, it make your life a lot easier in the long run. Yeah. Because, for example, one of the things that Emma's identified that you do need to inform about is the selection criteria, or your method of selecting people for redundancy. Now, if you've got a particular set of criteria that you propose to use, and a weighting system, whatever it might be that you're proposing to use for this exercise, and you're able to agree that with the reps, or even better if it's a trade union that's involved, you're able to agree with them that this is a fair way of doing it, and that shuts down potentially a lot of arguments that an individual might have when they then fall foul of that selection criteria. They can, of course, challenge the scores that they received against that criteria, but it's much more difficult for them to say, and also the criteria was complete rubbish as well, and it was set up expressly to ensure that I was selected, and it was completely unfair and arbitrary and entirely subjective, because the employer can say, well, we actually consulted with the employee representatives about this, and actually we reached agreements on it, and everyone was satisfied that this seemed like a fair way to proceed, and that makes your ability to defend any claims that arise from it that much strengthens your position in that regard. So yeah, it definitely is a good thing if you can reach agreement. Can't always be reached. The important thing is to demonstrate that you're not just paying lip service to the idea of consultation, that you are properly taking into consideration the issues that are raised. It might be, as I alluded to about giving notice, that everything has been said within a relatively short period of time. There's not that much more to be said, and consultation can be concluded, if you like, within the minimum period, because everyone agrees that there's not much more for us to say and there's no need for us to continue to have further meetings about it. But it also can be the case that you're quite close to reaching agreement, or there's still matters that have come up, or maybe there's been new information that's come to light, or there's new considerations that need to be taken on board, just shy of the 30 or 45 day period. And clearly, if you then just say, oh, bell's rung, 30 days is up, we're ending the consultation now, we've run out of time, then you're again going to leave yourself open to allegations that you haven't properly consulted. So do look to seek agreement if you can. Recognise that agreement or the discussions may end relatively quickly if there's not much more to say, but don't artificially bring them to an end simply because you're coming up to the relevant date if there are more genuine issues to be properly worked through with the reps.
And if you are experiencing difficulties with your staff reps, then do take advice on that as well, just to sort of add to that. Now, these sorts of conversations, these sorts of issues that employers are finding, they often fall within that sort of too difficult pile. And we're running an HR and leadership course on the 1st of July, so next week, led by performance psychologist and coach Dr. Jonathan Smith, where we are going to be looking at how we can effectively handle employee conversations. So it might be around returning to work, around bringing employees back from furlough, changing terms and conditions of employment. So not looking at that legal point, but actually how can we make these conversations work? How can we avoid conflict? And how can we reach a solution which is right for the business, but also right for the employee as well? So really great course, really excited to be able to bring that to you next week. I will be sending out the information around that if you would like to book and join us. It's online, it's virtual, it's 90 minutes, really interactive, great speaker, what's not to like. So yeah, really great. Can't wait to welcome you next week. So I'll be sending out information about that. So just in summary, Andy, just to bring it to a close, what would be your sort of key takeaways when we think about collective consultation?
It's really planning, I think, and it's a recognition that it's not this unmanageable, terrible, awful monster that you wish to avoid at all costs. As I said, the purpose behind the legislation is actually to try and smooth and streamline the consultation exercise when you are dealing with a large number of individuals that are affected by it. If you enter it on that basis and recognize actually this is supposed to be trying to make your life easier, and that you collate all of the issues into one piece where it's just being fed up to you by a small number of individuals, then that's a positive attitude to have towards it. But do plan, do work out, okay, well, who are we going to use? What's our constituencies? Who are the affected individuals? What does our timetable look like? Understand how we have to work through that. Make sure that you understand what's expected of you, but in addition, the reps, whoever they may be, understand what's expected of them too, so that they represent their delegates or their constituents appropriately. Make sure that you're clear about what you're trying to achieve with the reps and what you're expecting of them, but also so they can understand what they can reasonably get from you too, and factor in technology as well. What are we doing with, bearing in mind the remote working or the remote nature of a lot of work that we're doing at the moment, and also potentially people being absent for other reasons too. How can we make this process work for everyone and make sure everyone's properly enfranchised and has an opportunity to have their say?
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really good advice there, Andy. Thank you so much. I've just we have had some questions, but they're quite technical and sort of business specific. So I'm not going to deal with those online. What we'll do is we'll contact those individuals offline. And just to repeat again, if there are any questions about what Andy and I have discussed today, if you want to talk about redundancies or changing terms and conditions, or if you want to talk about other employment or business immigration issues that your business is facing at the moment, then we are open, we are here. Then do get in touch with us. As I said, I'll be sending out our contact information. Hope to see some of you next week if you're able to book onto our training course, and we will be running a webinar next month as well. We will be having a summer roundup, so do watch out for invitations. If you're not already signed up to receive our invites and our newsletters, then either email me or go onto our website where you can find information there about being able to subscribe. So thank you so much, Andy, again for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thanks, Emma.
And looking forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.